don't remember when I first started keeping track of the time. It wasn't intentional, the way some habits form without announcement or conscious decision. I've always been that way. The kind of person who notices things nobody else seems to care about, who tracks small patterns and feels compelled to document them even when there's no practical reason. My therapist in my 30s called it hypervigilance. My mother called it nervousness. I called it being thorough. Now I'm not sure what to call it, but I know it started 3 months ago, around the middle of December in my apartment in Portland, which is exactly the kind of detail that used to seem important but doesn't anymore. I work as a loss prevention specialist for a retail chain. The job is essentially professional paranoia. I spend 8 hours a day analyzing security footage, looking for their patterns of theft, watching employees, watching customers, noting inconsistencies in inventory reports. I've been doing it for 11 years. The work suited me because paranoia is useful in that field. It was respected. It was necessary. It was the job. I developed an eye for things that were slightly wrong, for the moments when someone's behavior deviated from the expected, for the small tells that indicated deception. When I left the office each day, I tried to leave that part of me behind. But it never fully stayed gone. I'd find myself analyzing the checkout clerk's movements at the grocery store, or noticing which customers lingered too long in the electronics section of Home Depot, or watching the parking lot attendant's routine and noting when it changed. The work had seeped into me, and the work had become the way I saw things. My apartment was on the 3rd floor of a mid-century building with thin walls and the kind of heating system that made irregular sounds, pipes clanking at odd hours. It was 740 square feet. I paid $1,800 a month. I moved there 5 years ago when I was divorced for the first time, and I never left. The place had this particular quality of silence to it, the kind that only exists in cities where so much sound is happening outside that it somehow becomes a kind of white noise that feels like quiet. You could stand in my living room and hear nothing and everything simultaneously. The walls were painted a color the landlord called eggshell white, but which looked more like the color of old teeth. I had a couch that was slightly too large for the space, which a television I watched without really watching, and more mirrors than most people would keep in a space that small. There was one in the bathroom, obviously, 2 in the bedroom, 1 on the closet door and 1 on the wall opposite the bed, and 1 in the entryway where I hung my coat. I'd bought the entryway mirror at a thrift store because I'd read somewhere that mirrors make small spaces feel larger. It was an old mirror, the kind with a wooden frame that had been painted and repainted multiple times, with gold leaf peeling off at the corners. The checking had started, as I remember it now, with the entryway mirror. I would come home from work around 6 in the evening, and I would look at myself in that mirror as I took off my coat. This was routine. This was automatic. I would check my appearance because it was what you did when you came home, the same way you checked your phone or your mail. But around early December, I started noticing something small. The angle was off, or at least I thought the angle was off. I remembered it being tilted downward at a particular angle, such that when I stood in front of it, I could see my face and most of my upper body. Then one day, I think it was a Tuesday, though I'm not certain about this anymore, I came home and the mirror was tilted higher. I could see the top of my head and my chest, but my face was cut off. I adjusted it back down to where I thought it should be. I didn't think anything of it. The frame was old, The mounting could have shifted. It was the kind of thing that happened. But over the course of the next 2 weeks, this continued. I would adjust the mirror down, and then days later it would be tilted up again. Or sometimes it would be tilted the opposite direction entirely, reflecting a different portion of the hallway. I started to pay attention to this in a way I didn't initially recognize as obsessive. I began to notice the position of the mirror almost as soon as I walked through the door. I would remember where I'd last positioned it, and I would compare it to where it was now. December 15th, Tuesday, I adjusted it down. December 18th, Friday, it was up again. I adjusted it down once more, and this time I paid closer attention to how I was positioning it. I made sure the frame was level with the floor, that the mounting bracket was tight, that it couldn't shift easily. I stood back and looked at my reflection and made a mental note of the exact angle.
Dear, it's 3 days later on a Monday. I came home, and the mirror was tilted upward again. At this point, something in me shifted slightly. I had lived alone for the entire 5 years I'd been in the apartment, except for a 3-month period when I dated someone named Rebecca, and we had broken up when she told me she felt like she was constantly being evaluated by me. Her words had stung, but I hadn't known how to respond to them truthfully, so I hadn't said anything. Since then, I'd been alone. Completely alone. I didn't have roommates. I didn't have a significant other. I didn't have anyone else in the apartment. The building itself was occupied by other people, but I didn't interact with my neighbors much. There was a woman upstairs who I sometimes heard pacing at night.
And to the left, there was an elderly man who played saxophone at odd hours, but I saw neither of them with any regularity. The idea that someone was adjusting the mirror in my apartment while I was at work should have frightened me immediately, but instead what I felt was something closer to confusion. It didn't make sense. There was no logical reason for someone to adjust a mirror in my entryway. It wasn't a valuable object. It wasn't anything someone would want to steal or move deliberately. I decided the mounting bracket was loose and needed to be tightened. I got my toolkit from under the bathroom sink. A small collection of basic tools I'd accumulated over the years, most of which I rarely used. And I tightened the bracket more thoroughly. I checked the mounting to ensure it was secure, and I positioned the mirror to the exact angle I wanted it at. Then I went back to work and didn't think about it for approximately 36 hours. That was my first mistake. When I came home on Wednesday evening, the mirror was tilted up again, and this time the bracket was exactly as tight as I'd left it. I stood in the entryway for what felt like a long time, just looking at it. I was trying to think of explanations. The building settles. Maybe the vibrations from traffic or the heating system were causing some kind of microscopic shifting. Maybe I was misremembering the angle, and the mirror hadn't actually moved at all. I'd read somewhere that human memory is not as reliable as we think it is, that we often construct memories after the fact based on what we expect to be true rather than what actually happened. And so maybe I was doing that now. Maybe I'd never adjusted the mirror to the angle I thought I had, and I was instead remembering a position that I'd wanted to remember. A false memory that felt real in retrospect. I adjusted it down again. This time I did something different. I got out my phone and I took a photograph of the mirror, capturing not just the mirror itself, but the surrounding area of the hallway, including the electrical outlet to the left and the small scuff mark on the wall to the right. This was a reference point. This was documentation. If the mirror moved again, I would know, because the angle would be visibly different from the photograph. I felt better having done this. I felt like I had taken control of the situation, even though there was no situation to control. There was probably nothing wrong. There was probably nothing at all. The next 3 days, nothing happened. The mirror stayed in the position I'd adjusted it to. I checked it each day when I came home, and it remained consistent with the photograph I'd taken. I felt a sense of relief, though also a faint sense of disappointment, which seemed odd at the time. I realized I had been anticipating that the mirror would move again, and now that it hadn't, the situation felt unsatisfying in some way, like I'd prepared for an event that didn't occur. The lack of resolution made me feel slightly unsettled. I had wanted the mystery to deepen so that I could solve it. Now that there was no mystery, I had to accept that there had been nothing there in the first place, that I had been imagining a problem where none existed, where this felt worse somehow than if the mirror had continued to move. But on Sunday evening, it was tilted upward again. I stood in the entryway with my coat still on, still damp from the rain, and I looked at the mirror. The angle was not dramatically different from where I'd positioned it. If someone had adjusted it without care, it would have been more noticeably off. This was a subtle shift, small enough that if I hadn't been looking for it, I might not have noticed at all. But I was looking for it, and I did notice. Someone had entered my apartment while I was at work and moved the mirror down just enough to make it clear they had done so, but not enough to make it impossible for me to rationalize. Or maybe the building had settled. Maybe vibrations from the heating system had caused a microscopic shift that had eventually manifested as a slightly different angle. Maybe I was experiencing the beginning of some kind of mental deterioration and I should see a doctor. I took another photograph. Then I went to my laptop and I pulled up the first photograph I'd taken on Wednesday. I opened an image editing program and I overlaid the two photographs. The angle was definitely different. The reflection in the mirror showed a slightly different portion of the hallway wall behind me. It was subtle, but it was there. Someone had definitely adjusted the mirror, or the building had settled, or I was having a minor psychotic break. One of those three things was true. I didn't tell anyone. Who would I tell? I had no close friends. I had my work colleagues, but I didn't socialize with them outside of the office. I had my parents, but we spoke monthly at best. And I couldn't imagine having a conversation with them that started with, "I think someone is breaking into my apartment to adjust mirrors." My ex-wife would have said something sarcastic about how this sounded exactly like the kind of thing I would invent in my head, and she would have been right to say that. There was no one to tell. So I didn't tell anyone. Instead, I started to prepare. Over the course of the next week, I installed a cheap webcam in my entryway, positioning it to capture the hallway and the mirror. I set it up to record continuously and to save video in 4-hour segments. The webcam cost $42. It was not high quality. The footage it captured was grainy, and the night vision mode made everything look slightly purple and unclear. But it was something. It was documentation. It was evidence that I was being rational and methodical about this, that I wasn't just paranoid, but instead appropriately cautious. I set up a folder on my laptop called Mirror Research, and I began storing the daily photographs and the video files in chronological order. I created a spreadsheet in which I recorded the date, the time I checked the mirror, the angle it was positioned at, measuring with a protractor that I bought specifically for this purpose, and whether anything had changed since the last observation. For the first 5 days after I installed the webcam, nothing happened. The mirror remained in the exact position I'd adjusted it to. I watched the video footage each evening, watching the empty hallway. Once he's looking for any sign of movement or disturbance, there was none. The footage was boring. It was hours and hours of unchanging space, the same gray hallway with the electrical outlet and the wall scuff mark, the same mirror in the same position. I found myself watching this footage even though there was nothing to see. I would watch sections at high speed, skipping through the hours looking for any moment where something changed. Most evenings I would spend 2 or 3 hours reviewing the day's footage. I was taking time off my evenings that I would normally have spent watching television or reading. The research had become my primary activity. By the 8th day, I was spending 4 to 5 hours each evening on this task. On the 9th day, something changed. I came home from work, and before I'd even taken off my coat, I could see that the mirror was tilted upward slightly. The angle was off. My heart rate increased immediately. I went directly to my laptop and I pulled up the footage from that day. I skipped through it quickly at first, then more slowly, looking for the moment when something would happen. The footage showed the hallway at 8:47 a.m. when I'd left for work. The mirror was positioned at the angle I'd set it to. Then the footage showed the hallway empty for hours. Then at 2:34 p.m., something changed. In the footage, the mirror appeared to shift, but it wasn't because someone had adjusted it. The shift was caused by the mirror's mount bracket catching on something. The webcam footage was grainy, but I could see the bracket moving slightly. And then the entire mirror tilted downward and then upward and then settled at a different angle than before. There was no person involved. There was no one touching it. The bracket had failed, or the wall had shifted, or some other physical explanation had occurred. The mirror had simply fallen and then repositioned itself. That was all. That was the entire explanation. I watched this moment in the footage 3 more times to make sure I was seeing it correctly. I was. The mirror had repositioned itself due to mechanical failure. There had been no intruder. No one had been adjusting the mirror. The mystery had a perfectly rational explanation, and I felt a sense of profound disappointment followed quickly by a sense of relief, followed by a sense of shame that I'd spent 9 days and a significant amount of money investigating something that had never happened. I uninstalled the webcam, I removed it from the entryway, and I put it back in its box. I deleted the folder called Mirror Research from my laptop. I deleted the photographs. I deleted the video footage. I tried not to think about how much time I had wasted on this, how I had essentially interrogated my own apartment based on a mechanical malfunction that I'd misinterpreted as something sinister. This was the kind of thing that made me wonder if Rebecca had been right, if the hypervigilance my therapist had diagnosed was actually something more serious, if I needed to make some kind of significant change in how I was processing the world. I adjusted the mirror back to the position I preferred. I looked at myself in it for a moment. My face was slightly gaunt. I'd been working long hours at my job, and I was losing weight. I needed to eat better. I needed to exercise. I needed to do something with my life other than spend evenings staring at footage of an empty hallway. I decided to end this. I decided to move forward. I decided to forget about the mirror and accept that it had simply been a mechanical malfunction. Nothing more at all. For exactly 6 days, nothing happened. The mirror remained in position. My life continued. I went to work, I came home, I watched television, I went to bed. The routine was consistent and unremarkable. I stopped thinking about the mirror. I stopped thinking about the webcam footage. I stopped thinking about the 9 days I'd spent investigating nothing. Life returned to a kind of normal rhythm. On the 7th day, I came home, and the mirror was completely turned around. It was facing the wall. The back of the mirror was toward the hallway, and the reflective surface was pressed against the wall, hidden completely from view. This was different. This was not a mechanical malfunction. This was not something that could be explained by a loose bracket or a shift in the wall. Someone had come into my apartment and had deliberately turned the mirror to face the wall. There was intentionality in this action. There was purpose. There was someone in my apartment and they were sending a message. I stood in the entryway for what felt like a very long time. The rain was dripping off my coat onto the hardwood floor. I was still holding my work bag. My heart was beating very fast. I tried to think about what to do. I tried to think about what the rational response was to this situation. The rational response was to call the police. The rational response was to check my apartment to see if anything had been stolen. The rational response was to ensure my safety first and then contact authorities. But instead of doing any of those things, I stood there and I looked at the back of the mirror. After approximately 30 seconds, I walked back to the bedrooms. I checked my bedroom first. Nothing appeared to be out of place. My bed was made, my dresser was intact, my closet door was closed. The mirror on the closet door was in its normal position. I checked the second bedroom, and which I used as an office. My desk was covered with files and papers from work. My chair was in front of the desk. My computer was sitting there untouched. Nothing had been moved. Nothing had been stolen. Then I checked the kitchen, the bathroom, the living room. Everything appeared to be exactly as I'd left it. I had no explanation for how the mirror had been turned around. I had no way to explain who had done it. I did not have any option except to call the police. But instead I picked up the mirror and I turned it back around. This was my second mistake. I should have called the police immediately. I should have documented the scene. I should have waited for authorities to arrive and investigate. But I didn't. Instead, I turned the mirror back around and I looked at myself in it and I tried to figure out what was happening. The police, when I did eventually call them, told me there was no evidence of forced entry. My door locks were intact. There were no signs of tampering, no windows had been forced open, there were no fingerprints, no obvious indicators that anyone had been in the apartment. They asked me what had been stolen, and I told them nothing. They asked me if I'd given anyone else a key, and I told them no. They asked me if I'd left my door unlocked, and I told them I was certain I'd locked it before I left that morning. They took a report. They seemed slightly skeptical about the entire situation, as though a mirror being turned around didn't constitute a legitimate emergency, which I suppose was technically correct. They said they would increase patrols in the building, but they didn't seem to believe that anything had actually happened. Yet after they left, I sat on my couch in the dark. The television was off. The apartment was silent. I was trying to figure out what was real and what was not real. The mirror had definitely been turned around. That was real. I had definitely seen it facing the wall. But how had someone gotten into the apartment? And why would someone do this? What was the purpose? What was the message? I couldn't construct a narrative that made sense. There was no logical sequence of events that could explain what I was experiencing. I decided to install better locks. I decided to put a chain lock on my door in addition to the deadbolt. I decided to get a second webcam and to place it inside my apartment in the living room, where it could capture anyone moving through the main area. I decided to be more careful. I decided to be more vigilant, where I decided to treat this as a real threat rather than something to rationalize away. For the next 2 weeks, nothing happened. The mirror remained in its position. I came home each day and I checked it immediately. I would stand in the entryway and I would look at the mirror and I would verify that it was still facing outward, that it hadn't been turned around again. The webcam footage showed nothing. Hours and hours of empty hallway and empty living room. I was sleeping poorly. I was waking up at 3 in the morning and lying in the darkness, listening for sounds that didn't come. I was leaving work slightly early so that I could get home before it got dark. I was becoming increasingly hypervigilant, but now there was a practical reason for it. Now I had evidence that something was wrong. Now I was justified in my concern. Around the middle of January, I started keeping a different kind of record. I started noting the times when I was most alert, the times when I was checking the mirror, and the times when I was sleeping. I was trying to find a pattern. I was trying to figure out if the person was coming into my apartment on a schedule. If I could identify the schedule, I might be able to catch them. I might be able to set up a trap or some kind of alarm that would alert me to their presence. I was thinking about this constantly. I was thinking about little else. On January 17th at 11:47 p.m., I heard something in my apartment that sounded like movement in the hallway. I got out of bed. I turned on the lights in the bedroom. I went to my laptop and I pulled up the footage from the webcam in the living room. There was nothing. The living room was empty. Almost the hallway was empty. I had heard nothing, or I had heard something that was part of the normal settling of the building, the pipes, the heating system, any of 100 possible explanations. But my heart rate was elevated and I couldn't get back to sleep. I lay in bed and I listened to the apartment for the rest of the night. I waited for sounds that didn't come. By the end of January, I had started checking the mirror every hour. I would set a timer on my phone, and every time it went off, I would walk to the entryway, and I would look at the mirror. I would verify that it was in the correct position. I would take a photograph to document that it was still facing outward. This was becoming compulsive. This was becoming something that I couldn't control. I would check the mirror even when it wasn't time to, even before the timer went off, because I felt anxious, not knowing if the mirror had been moved. I would go to work and I would spend the day thinking about the mirror. I would come home and I would check it immediately. And I would feel a brief sense of relief when I verified that nothing had changed. Then that relief would fade and I would worry about what time the next check should be. I brought the issue up with my supervisor at work because I was requesting additional time off and I wanted to have an explanation that would sound reasonable. I told him that I was having some personal issues and that I needed to be able to leave slightly early on certain days. He said it was fine, that I had the vacation time if I needed it, that everyone went through periods where they needed to take care of personal matters. He was being kind about it, which somehow made it worse. His kindness made me aware that I was exhibiting behavior that warranted kindness, that I was not handling this well, that I was falling apart in a way that was visible to other people. By early February, I had stopped going to work at full capacity. I was calling in sick on days when I felt too anxious to leave the apartment. I was checking the mirror more frequently. The timer was set for every 30 minutes. Every 30 minutes my phone would go off, and I would interrupt whatever I was doing to walk to the entryway. I would check the mirror, I would take a photograph, I would return to what I was doing. I had approximately 20 hours of documentation showing the mirror in its correct position. I had 4 backup copies of this documentation stored in different locations. I had a written log detailing exactly when each check had occurred and what I'd observed. On February 11th, I called in sick to work. I told my supervisor that I wasn't feeling well and that I needed to take a personal day. What I actually did was I stayed home and I watched the webcam footage in real time. I sat at my laptop and I watched the hallway all day. I watched the hallway and the entryway and the mirror. Nothing happened. The mirror remained in its correct position. No one came to my apartment. No one entered my hallway. The entire day was empty and unchanged, and I felt simultaneously disappointed and relieved. The next day I went back to work. I felt slightly better, slightly more stable. The day without anything happening had given me a sense of perspective. Maybe the issue had resolved itself. Maybe whoever had been turning the mirror around had given up. Maybe I had been overthinking this entire situation. Maybe I could return to some kind of normal. That evening I came home, and the mirror was tilted at a 30-degree angle. Not turned around. Not adjusted slightly. Tilted at an extreme angle that suggested it had been moved with purpose and force. I stood in the entryway and I looked at this mirror, and I felt something inside me break. I felt control slipping. I felt the narrative I'd been constructing for the past 2 months falling apart. I tilted the mirror back to the correct position. Then I sat on my couch, and I didn't move for 3 hours. The checking increased after that. The timer was set for every 15 minutes. Every 15 minutes, I was walking to the entryway. Every 15 minutes, I was verifying that the mirror was in the correct position. 96 times per day, I was checking the mirror. I was documenting each check. My life had become primarily about checking the mirror. The job had become secondary. Sleep had become secondary. Food had become secondary. The primary function of my existence was now to check the mirror every 15 minutes and verify that nothing had changed. At some point during this period, I think it was in mid-February, though I'm not entirely certain of the dates anymore, I realized that I wasn't sleeping in my bedroom anymore. I had moved into the living room. I brought my mattress to the living room and I was sleeping on it there, positioned so that I could see the entryway and the mirror. I had positioned my laptop on a stand next to the mattress, and I had the webcam footage running on a continuous loop. I was able to watch the hallway from my sleeping position. I was able to verify that no one was coming into my apartment. I was able to respond immediately if anything changed. My supervisor at work called me on February 24th. He asked me if I was okay. He said that I'd called in sick 4 times in the past 2 weeks, and that it was starting to affect the team. He wanted to know if there was something I needed to talk about, if I needed to take leave, if there was something I needed from the company. I told him that I was fine, that I was just dealing with some personal issues, that I would be back to normal very soon. He said that I could take some time off if I needed to, that the company would be flexible. I told him that I didn't need time off. I told him that I would be at work tomorrow. I didn't go to work tomorrow. I stayed home and I checked the mirror. I checked it at 6:15 a.m. I checked it at 6:30 a.m. I checked it at 6:45 a.m. I didn't leave the apartment. I didn't call in. I simply didn't show up. By March, I had lost the job. They had called me repeatedly, and then they had sent me a termination letter. The letter said that I was being terminated due to excessive absenteeism and failure to respond to communication. The letter was professional. The letter was not unkind. The letter simply stated facts about my failure to meet the obligations of my employment. I read the letter once, and then I filed it in a folder, and I didn't think about work anymore. Without the job, I had more time to focus on the mirror. I had more time to check it, to document my observations, to analyze the patterns. But the patterns were the same as they had always been. The mirror would remain in the correct position for days or weeks, and then suddenly it would be moved. The movements were unpredictable. They were random, they were irrational. They didn't follow a schedule or a logic that I could identify. This was the most maddening part. If there had been a pattern, I could have predicted when the next movement would occur. If there had been a logic to the movements, I could have understood the purpose. But the movements seemed designed specifically to be unpredictable. I started keeping track of my own sleep and meals because I realized I was forgetting to eat, and I was sleeping at random times, 8 to 9 hours at once, then being awake for 18 hours, then sleeping again. My refrigerator was empty most of the time. I was ordering food delivery, but often I would forget that I'd ordered it, and it would spoil on my counter. I was losing weight rapidly. I could see my ribs. I could see my bones. I was becoming thin in a way that felt dangerous, that felt like I was disappearing from the inside out. In late March, I made a decision. I decided that I needed to understand what was happening. I decided that I needed to move the mirror to a different location and see if it would still be adjusted when I wasn't checking it. If the mirror was being adjusted regardless of where it was, then there was definitely someone entering my apartment. If the mirror stopped being adjusted when I moved it, then perhaps the issue was with the location itself rather than with the mirror. He states perhaps there was something in the wall or the mounting that was causing the movements. Perhaps I could solve this. I took the mirror down from the wall. I wrapped it carefully in blankets and I moved it to the bedroom. I hung it on the wall above my dresser, positioning it to face outward toward the room. Then I left the entryway empty. I sealed the brackets to the wall with a thick layer of paint so that if they were moved, it would be obvious. I set up the webcam to face the now empty entryway. I set up another webcam in the bedroom, positioned to watch the mirror. I started a new document in my research folder. I named it Mirror Relocation Experiment. For the first week after moving the mirror, nothing happened. The mirror remained above my dresser, unmoved, untouched. The brackets in the entryway remained sealed with paint, and the apartment was still. I checked the mirror every hour now, allowing myself to expand the interval, since I'd spent so much time not sleeping and I was beginning to feel the physical effects of constant vigilance. I was dizzy most of the time. I was having difficulty focusing on anything other than the mirror. My apartment was becoming cluttered with notebooks and photographs and printed out sections of webcam footage. The walls were covered with documents. I had created a kind of timeline on the living room wall, using yarn to connect different observations, creating a visual map of when the mirror had moved and what else had been happening at those times. On April 2nd, I came home from a trip to the grocery store, my first trip outside the apartment in 3 weeks, and I found that the mirror had been moved again. It was not above the dresser. It had been taken down, and it was now lying flat on my bed, with the reflective surface facing downward. I felt something in my chest tighten. The bedroom door had been closed when I left. I was certain of this. I locked my apartment and I walked to the grocery store, and I was gone for approximately 90 minutes. And when I returned, the mirror had been moved. Someone had definitely been in my apartment. I was not imagining this. This was real. This was happening. And they were sending a message. They were telling me that they could enter whenever they wanted. They were telling me that the mirror was theirs, or that I couldn't keep it where I wanted it, or that I couldn't protect anything. The message was clear. The message was that I was not in control. I sat on the bed next to the mirror and I cried. I cried because I was afraid and because I was exhausted and because I realized that I'd spent months investigating this problem and I'd made no progress. The intruder was still coming. The mirror was still being moved. I was still unable to stop it. I called the police again. The same officer came, or at least it was an officer from the same precinct. He listened to my story and he looked at my apartment and he saw the walls covered with photographs and notes and timelines, and he asked me very gently if I had considered talking to a mental health professional. He said it in a way that wasn't unkind, but it was clear that he didn't believe me. He said that there were no signs of forced entry. He said that my locks were intact. He said that it was possible that I was experiencing some kind of stress-related episode and that there were resources available to help me. He left his card and he left the apartment. After he left, I looked around at my apartment and I saw it the way he had seen it. I saw the walls covered with my research. I saw the notebooks filled with observations that probably seemed obsessive and nonsensical to anyone looking at them. I saw the mattress on the living room floor. I saw the empty food containers. I saw the person I had become, and I understood that no one would believe me. No one would believe that someone was entering my apartment and moving a mirror. Everyone would believe instead that I was falling apart, that I was experiencing some kind of mental crisis, that I was creating a narrative to explain what was actually just deteriorating mental health. But I knew what I had experienced. I knew that the mirror had been moved. I knew that I had locked my apartment. I knew that there was no explanation for how these things could both be true. I decided to set a trap. I decided to catch whoever was doing this. I went to a hardware store and I bought materials to create a kind of alarm system. I bought motion detecting lights, bells that would chime if a door was opened, pressure sensitive tape that would trigger if something was moved. I spent an entire day installing these devices throughout my apartment. I installed them at the entry door, at the windows, around the mirror. I wanted to create an environment where any disturbance would create noise, light, and evidence. That night I didn't sleep. I sat in my apartment and I waited. I wanted to experience the moment when the alarm went off. I wanted to prove to myself that I wasn't imagining this. I wanted to catch them in the act. Nothing happened that night. The next night, nothing happened. The next week, nothing happened. The alarms were installed and ready, and nothing triggered them. The mirror remained in place. My apartment remained unchanged. I was sitting in my apartment surrounded by sensors and bells and lights, and nothing was triggering any of them. Either my trap was ineffective, or whoever was entering my apartment was able to do so in a way that circumvented my security measures. Or I was insane, and I had never been sane. And this entire thing had been a kind of elaborate delusion that I had constructed over months to explain something that didn't exist. I started checking the mirror at different times. Instead of checking every hour, I would check it at random intervals. I would set alarms at irregular times and check the mirror and then extend the time before the next check. I was trying to be unpredictable. I was trying to catch the pattern. I was trying to catch them at a moment when they didn't expect me. But the mirror was never moving during the times when I was checking. It was only moving when I wasn't home, or when I was sleeping, or when I was looking away. It was only moving when I couldn't see it. In late April, around the middle of the month, I did something I had never done before. I stayed awake all night. I didn't sleep. I stayed awake from 6 p.m. one evening until 6 p.m. the next day. I sat in my apartment and I stayed awake and I watched. I watched the mirror. I watched the entryway. I watched the webcam footage on my laptop. Where for a full 24 hours, I was conscious and vigilant and waiting. Nothing happened. At 6 p.m. the next evening, absolutely exhausted and beginning to hallucinate slightly from the lack of sleep, I decided to take a nap. I set an alarm for 90 minutes. I lay on my mattress in the living room and I closed my eyes and I fell asleep almost immediately. When I woke up, the alarm hadn't gone off. I had slept for 7 hours, and the mirror had been moved again. It was back in the entryway, mounted on the wall, tilted at a 45-degree angle. I stood in the entryway and I looked at the mirror and I understood something fundamental about my situation. Whoever was doing this, whatever was doing this, was not operating under the same constraints as I was. They could move the mirror whenever I wasn't looking. They could do it when I was asleep or when I was away or when I was distracted. They had more time than I did because they didn't need to sleep, or they had access to my apartment in a way that I couldn't prevent. Or I was simply insane and I was moving the mirror myself and forgetting about it afterward. All three of these possibilities seemed equally plausible to me now. I stood in the entryway for a long time looking at the tilted mirror and my reflection in it, which was distorted by the angle, which made my face look fractured and broken. I barely recognized myself. I barely looked human. I looked like something that was breaking down. At a molecular level, something that was decomposing while still being alive. I took the mirror down from the wall. I wrapped it in blankets again. This time I took it to the bathroom. I wanted to experiment with putting it in a different room, in a smaller space, in an environment that was easier to monitor. I mounted it above the bathroom sink. I positioned it carefully. I took a photograph of the angle. Then I sealed my apartment. I closed all the windows, and I locked all the doors, and I set every single alarm I had installed. I was going to test something. I was going to see if anything would change. For 3 days, I stayed in my apartment, and I didn't leave. I didn't go to get food. I had some canned goods, and I ate those. I drank water from the tap. I used the bathroom, and I took showers. I did not leave the apartment. I checked the mirror regularly. The mirror remained in the position I'd placed it. The alarms remained untripped. The apartment remained sealed. On the 4th day, hunger drove me out. I needed to go to the grocery store. I needed food. I locked up my apartment carefully, setting all the alarms, checking all the doors, ensuring that everything was secured. Then I went to the grocery store. I was gone for 45 minutes. When I came home, the mirror was in the living room, sitting on the floor, leaning against the wall. It had been moved from the bathroom to the living room. It was leaning against the wall casually, as though someone had just taken it down and placed it there without thinking about it. I stood in my apartment with bags of groceries in my hands, and I looked at the mirror and I felt something very cold move through me. I put the groceries down. I checked the apartment. All the doors were still locked. All the windows were still locked. All the alarms were still untripped. It was impossible. It was impossible for the mirror to have been moved without at least one of the alarms being triggered. It was impossible for someone to have entered the apartment without leaving any evidence of entry. Yet the mirror had definitely been moved. The mirror was definitely in a different location. This was real. I picked the mirror up and I looked at my reflection in it. I looked completely insane. I looked like someone who had been losing weight and not sleeping properly for months. I looked like someone who was having a breakdown. I looked like someone who should be in a hospital. I looked at myself for a long time in that mirror, and I tried to remember when my life had become this. I tried to remember what the trigger was, what the beginning was, what the moment had been where things started to go wrong. I couldn't identify it. There was no single moment. There was the mirror being adjusted slightly, and then there was the mirror being moved, and then there was the obsessive checking, and then there was the job loss, and then there was the isolation, and then there was the complete deterioration of my ability to distinguish between what was real and what was my own creation. I couldn't point to a single moment where I could have done something different. I could only see the progression. I could only see the way one thing had led to another, the way each decision had seemed logical at the time, but had led to this. I sat down on the floor and I held the mirror, and I stayed there for several hours. I was thinking about the person I had been 3 months ago. I was thinking about how I'd seemed normal then, or at least normal enough. I was thinking about how the checking had seemed like a reasonable response to a strange situation. I was thinking about how each escalation had seemed justified. I was thinking about how I'd made every decision based on what seemed logical at the time. Sometime during that evening, I decided that I was going to try something different. I was going to stop checking the mirror. I was going to stop documenting the movements. I was going to stop treating it as a mystery to solve. I was going to instead try to ignore it completely. If the mirror moved, I would try not to think about it. If the mirror was in a different position, I would try not to care. I was going to treat the mirror as something irrelevant, something that didn't matter, something that I could choose not to engage with. I put the mirror back in the entryway. I mounted it on the wall at the angle I preferred. I adjusted it carefully, then I took a photograph. Then I went to my bedroom and I closed the door and I tried to not think about the mirror. That night I was able to sleep in my bedroom instead of on a mattress in the living room. I slept for 10 hours. It was the first time I'd slept properly in months. When I woke up, I felt slightly less broken than I had been. I felt like the act of deciding to stop engaging with this had given me some kind of reprieve from the exhaustion and the obsession. I made coffee. I sat in my kitchen and I drank it, and I tried not to think about the entryway. I tried not to think about the mirror. I tried to behave like a normal person who was just living their life. I spent the morning reading a book. It was the first time I'd read anything other than my own research notes in months. It felt surreal. It felt like I was pretending to be someone else. At some point around 2 p.m, I walked past the entryway. I didn't deliberately look at the mirror, but I saw it in my peripheral vision. The angle was correct. It was in the position I'd left it. Nothing had changed. I felt relief. I felt like maybe this was working, like maybe I could actually move past this if I just didn't engage with it. For 2 days, this continued. I didn't check the mirror. I didn't photograph it. I didn't check the webcam footage. I just lived in my apartment, and I tried to accept that either someone was moving the mirror and I was just choosing not to monitor it, or it wasn't being moved at all and had never actually been moved. And this entire thing had been a kind of elaborate psychological episode that I'd created in my own mind. Either way, checking it and obsessing over it wasn't helping me. Either way, I needed to move forward. On the 3rd day of this experiment, I woke up and I decided that I was going to call my mother. I hadn't spoken to her in over a month. I hadn't answered her messages or responded to her calls. I had simply shut her out along with everything else. But I decided that I needed to talk to someone. I needed to have a conversation with a real human being that wasn't about the mirror. I decided to call her. We talked for 20 minutes. She asked me how I was doing, and I told her that I was fine, that I'd just been busy with work. I didn't tell her that I'd lost my job, and I didn't tell her that I'd spent months investigating a mirror. I didn't tell her that I'd completely broken down. I just told her that I was fine and that I was sorry I hadn't called sooner. She seemed relieved to hear from me. She said that she'd been worried. She asked if I wanted to come home for a weekend, back to Seattle where she lived. I said maybe that I would think about it. After I hung up the phone, I felt slightly better. I felt slightly more connected to the world. I felt like maybe there was a possibility of moving forward from this. That evening, I deliberately walked past the entryway and I looked at the mirror. The mirror was turned to face the wall. It was facing the wall like it had been that time in December. The back of the mirror was toward the hallway and the reflective surface was hidden. When I stood there and I looked at the back of the mirror and I felt something shift inside me. All the progress I'd made, all the acceptance I'd built up, all the decision to move forward, it all dissolved. The message was clear. I was being watched. I was being monitored. Every decision I made, everything I did, it was all being witnessed and responded to. I turned the mirror around. I looked at myself in it and I tried to figure out what to do. I was alone in my apartment. I was unemployed. I had maybe 2 weeks of money left. Before I ran out, I had no support system. My family thought I was fine. My ex-wife would likely tell me that I was insane. I had no friends. I had isolated myself completely. And something in my apartment was moving the mirror. Something was telling me that it was aware of me. Something was responding to my decisions, where I made a decision. It was an important decision, and I knew at the time that I was making it that this decision would change something. I decided that I was going to set up a camera that would run continuously without my knowledge. I was going to leave the camera running while I was away or asleep, and I was not going to check the footage until something had definitely changed. I was going to give myself a period of time, let's say a week, where I would not check the mirror at all, and I would not monitor the footage at all. I would just live in my apartment, and at the end of the week, I would check the footage, and I would see what had happened when I wasn't watching. I bought a 3rd webcam, a better one this time with higher resolution and better night vision. I set it up in the entryway position to capture the mirror from a different angle than in the previous camera. I set it to record continuously. I set it to save footage in daily files. Then I decided that for 1 week, I would not watch the footage. I would not check the mirror. I would just live. That week was strange. It was strange because I kept wanting to check the footage. I kept having to resist the urge to walk to the entryway and look at the mirror. I kept having to remind myself that I'd made a decision and I was going to see it through. But I did. I made it through an entire week without checking. I went to the grocery store. I took walks. I read. I slept. I had coffee in the morning. I tried to live like a normal person. At the end of the week, I didn't immediately check the footage. I waited until evening. I opened my laptop and I opened the video files from the past 7 days. Then I started to watch. For the first 3 days, the footage showed nothing unusual. The mirror was in its position. I walked past it occasionally. Nothing moved. There was nothing there. On the 4th day of footage, something appeared. At 3:47 a.m., while I was asleep in my bedroom, the mirror's angle shifted. But it wasn't subtle. The shift was significant. It was as though the mirror had been pulled downward with force. The frame jolted. The angle changed dramatically. I rewound the footage and played it again. At 3:47 a.m., the mirror moved. But there was no person visible in the footage. There was no one touching it. There was no obvious mechanism causing it to move. The mirror simply changed its angle as though it had moved on its own. I felt cold. I played the footage again and again. At 3:47 a.m., the mirror moved. That was the only explanation I could derive from what I was seeing. The mirror had moved independently, without any external force, without any visible cause. It had just moved. At 4:12 a.m., the mirror moved again. It tilted upward this time, back toward its original angle. And again, there was no visible cause. There was no person. There was no mechanism. The mirror simply moved. I watched the rest of the footage from that day. At 6:30 a.m., the mirror moved. At 8:15 a.m., it moved. At 11:22 a.m., it moved. The mirror kept moving throughout the day at irregular intervals, and every time there was nothing visible that could explain the movement. I watched the footage from the remaining 3 days and the pattern continued. The mirror was moving on its own. And the mirror was responding to something that I couldn't see. The mirror was demonstrating that there was something in my apartment that existed outside of my normal perception. I sat back from my laptop and I tried to process this. I was watching myself descend into some kind of mental state that I couldn't control. I was watching myself accept that the mirror was moving on its own because that was the only explanation that made sense given what I was seeing. I was abandoning the idea that someone was physically entering my apartment. I was abandoning the idea that any of this could be explained rationally. I was entering a new phase where I had to accept something that didn't make sense. Or maybe the camera was malfunctioning. Maybe the footage was corrupted. Maybe there was some kind of artifact in the video that made it look like the mirror was moving when it wasn't actually moving. But I knew that wasn't true. I'd purchased an expensive camera. I'd set it up carefully. The footage was clear. The movements were real. I did something that I should have done months ago. I called a mental health professional. I told them what I'd been experiencing. I told them about the months of checking and obsessing. I told them about the job loss and the isolation. I told them about the mirror moving on its own. They asked me some questions, and they asked me if I was having any thoughts of harming myself or others. I told them that I wasn't. They recommended that I come in for an evaluation. I made an appointment. The evaluation was 3 days away. For 3 days, when I lived in my apartment and I didn't check the mirror and I didn't watch the footage, I just waited. I tried not to think about what I'd seen. I tried not to think about what it meant. I tried to just exist until the evaluation. When I went to the evaluation, the psychologist asked me detailed questions about my history, my work, my family, my relationships. She asked me about the mirror. She asked me to describe exactly what I'd been experiencing. She listened carefully, and she took notes. When I was done, she told me that I was experiencing what sounded like obsessive-compulsive disorder with some elements of delusional thinking. She said that the checking behavior and the obsessive documentation were hallmarks of OCD. She said that the belief that the mirror was moving on its own could be part of a delusional system that my brain had constructed to make sense of the compulsions. She recommended medication, she recommended therapy, she recommended that I take a medical leave from work, which I had to explain was already unnecessary since I'd lost the job. She was sympathetic about that. She said that what I was experiencing was not uncommon and that with proper treatment I could recover. She prescribed me an antidepressant and an antipsychotic. She gave me a referral to a therapist. She told me to start taking the medication immediately and to schedule another appointment with her in 2 weeks. I took the medication that evening. It made me feel slightly numb, slightly distant from everything. It made the world feel like it was at a slight remove. I took it the next evening and the next evening. I continued to take it every day. After a week of medication, I felt less anxious about the mirror. I felt like the obsession was loosening its grip slightly. I didn't have the urgent need to check it constantly. I didn't have the sense of impending doom that had been present before. I felt like maybe the medication was helping. I felt like maybe I could actually recover from this. But I also stopped thinking about the mirror. I stopped engaging with the observations I'd been making. I stopped checking the footage. I put the webcams away. I decided to try to move forward. 2 weeks later, I had a follow-up appointment with the psychologist. She asked me how I was doing. I told her that I felt better, that the medication was helping, that the obsessive thoughts had decreased. She seemed satisfied with this. She kept me on the same medication and scheduled another appointment for a month away. I started the therapy as well. My therapist asked me about my childhood, about my relationship with my mother, about the divorce, about my career. She asked me about what I thought the mirror represented. I didn't have a good answer. The mirror represented the thing I couldn't understand, the thing I couldn't control, the thing that kept shifting outside of my comprehension. My therapist said that maybe that was the point. Maybe my unconscious mind was using the mirror as a way to process feelings of helplessness and loss of control that I had in other areas of my life. She said that by treating the OCD compulsions, by stopping the checking behavior, I would also reduce the power that the symbol had over me. I continued taking the medication. I continued going to therapy. I slowly stopped checking the mirror. I slowly started to engage with the world again. I called my mother and I told her that I'd been struggling but that I was getting help. I told her that I'd lost my job but that I was looking for new work. I told her that I was seeing a therapist and taking medication. She was supportive. She offered to help financially if I needed it. I told her I would be okay. After 4 weeks, I started to feel something that resembled normalcy. The apartment didn't feel as oppressive. The mirror didn't feel as threatening. It was just a mirror, sitting in the entryway, reflecting the hallway and part of my face when I walked past it. It was just an object. It had no agency. It had no meaning beyond what I was assigning to it. This state of something like recovery lasted for approximately 2 weeks. I was going to therapy twice a week. I was taking my medication every day. I was sleeping better. I was eating better. I was slowly beginning to feel like I might be able to move past this entire experience and return to something resembling a normal life. Then, early one morning, I woke up and I realized that I hadn't checked what time it was in several hours. I looked at my phone. It was 3:14 a.m., and I remembered that the mirror had moved at 3:47 a.m. on that day when I was watching the footage. The time was approaching. The time was almost here. I got out of bed and I went to the entryway. I looked at the mirror. It was in the position I'd left it. Nothing had changed. I looked at the time. It was 3:42 a.m. I stood there and I waited. At 3:47 a.m., I was looking at the mirror and watching to see if it would move. It didn't move. The mirror remained in its position. I waited for 5 minutes, then 10 minutes. Nothing happened. The mirror didn't move. And I felt disappointed. I felt like the medication was working so well that it was preventing even the interesting things from happening, that it was smoothing away even the mysteries and leaving only a flat, boring reality. I went back to bed and I lay there and I felt the weight of the normalcy that was settling over me. I felt the weight of accepting that the mirror was just a mirror, that it had never moved on its own, that I had been creating a narrative in my own mind to explain what was essentially a mental health crisis. I felt the weight of having to accept that none of it was real, that all those months of investigation and fear and obsession had been, in the end, just symptoms of an illness. But I also felt something else. I felt something that was underneath the medication and the therapy and the rational explanations. I felt a kind of awareness that wouldn't go away. I felt the knowledge that on the footage I'd watched, the mirror had moved at 3:47 a.m. Whether that movement was real or whether it was a hallucination or whether it was some kind of artifact in the video or whether it was my brain creating a false memory of seeing movement that was never there. I felt the knowledge that I had experienced something, whether that something was internal or external, and that I had not fully accepted the explanation, that it was all just in my head. The medication continued to work. The obsessive thoughts continued to decrease. But I also slowly, over the course of the next month, stopped taking the medication. I didn't stop deliberately. I just began to skip doses. I would take it one day and skip the next day. I would take it for 3 days and then skip for 2 days. The psychologist noticed at my next appointment that I seemed less compliant with the regimen. She asked me if I was taking the medication as prescribed. I told her I was lying. By July, I'd stopped taking the medication entirely. I told my therapist that I felt like I didn't need it anymore, that I was managing my symptoms through therapy and lifestyle changes. My therapist was skeptical, but she also said that ultimately the decision was mine. She recommended that I stay on the medication for at least 6 months, but she said she couldn't force me. I assured her that I would think about it. I didn't think about it. I just stopped going to therapy. I stopped taking the medication. I gradually began to check the mirror again. Slowly at first, just occasional checks, and then more frequently. I began to document observations again. I began to engage with the mystery again, because the truth was that I had never stopped believing that something was happening with the mirror. I had just learned to hide it. I had learned to present myself as recovered while continuing in private to investigate the same questions. I had learned to lie to the psychologist and the therapist and my family while maintaining a facade of normalcy. By August, I was back to checking the mirror multiple times daily. By September, I was spending most of my evenings reviewing webcam footage. By October, I had obtained new employment, a job at a different retail company doing the same kind of work I'd done before. The job was easier this time because I knew what to look for, and I was in a kind of protective disguise, presenting myself as someone who was stable and well-adjusted and capable. In my apartment, I set up new systems, new cameras, new documentation. I was more careful this time. I made sure the research was hidden. I made sure that no one coming into the apartment would realize what I was doing. I'd learned my lesson about letting people see my work. Now it is March 31st. It is 3 months before the 1-year anniversary of the day. The mirror first tilted upward, and I noticed something was wrong. I've been checking the mirror regularly. I have documented hundreds of movements. I've watched hours and hours of footage, and I still cannot explain it. Sometimes I think about what the psychologist said about how this might all be in my head, how the OCD and the delusional thinking might be explaining everything. Sometimes I think about the medication and how I felt slightly better when I was on it, even though that better feeling was bought at the cost of not noticing anything at all. But then I watch the footage and I see the mirror move when no one is touching it, and I can't accept that explanation. I can't accept that I'm crazy. I can't accept that all of this is just my own mind creating patterns where there is nothing. So I keep checking, I keep documenting, I keep investigating. And at 3 a.m. most nights, I wake up and I walk to the entryway and I look at the mirror. I look at the angle. I look at the reflection of my face in it, which is thinner now than it was a year ago, which shows the strain of months of investigation and the knowledge that something is here with me, something that will not go away. And sometimes I wonder if I'm checking the mirror to understand what it's doing, or if I'm checking the mirror because the mirror is checking me back. I wonder if the purpose of all this is to understand the mystery, or if the purpose is something else entirely, something that I am not yet aware of, something that will only become clear once I have spent enough time with the mirror, once I have checked it enough times, once I have surrendered completely to the knowledge that I cannot control this.